Night of July 3rd, 1894, Chicago's South Side rail yards near Pullman. The sky is the color of old iron. Smoke hangs low over the tracks like a ceiling. Somewhere in the dark, a telegraph key is clicking itself raw, messages, warnings, orders, while the city holds its breath. Then the sound arrives. Not a whistle, not the familiar, comforting clack of commerce, but boots, hundreds of them, rhythmic, heavy, official. Federal troops pouring into Chicago under orders from President Grover Cleveland, moving to pry the nation's railroads back open. They've been sent to force motion into a system that has been deliberately, defiantly jammed. They've been sent because a private company's collapse of trust has now become a national crisis. Out in the darkness, rail cars sit like carcasses. Some still wear their polished skins. Pullman cars, the luxury capsules that made overnight travel feel like a hotel gliding across the continent. The jewel of modern America, the product that carried presidents and millionaires. The rolling proof that American industry could build miracles. And yet tonight, those miracles are becoming targets. Across Chicago and the Midwest, workers are refusing to move trains that haul Pullman cars. The boycott has spread like a fever through the rails, an artery-clogging rebellion that threatens to starve the country's economy west of Chicago. The government has already gone to court for an injunction to break the strike. Now it has brought soldiers, but the soldiers don't arrive into peace. With the military presence comes panic and ignition. Angry crowds surge near the yards. A thrown rock becomes a volley. A shouted insult becomes a stampede. Wood splinters. Glass erupts. Firelight begins to dance across steel, first small, then confident, until the flames are tall enough to paint the smoke a sick orange. The rails that once carried dreams now carry violence, and by the time this struggle burns itself out, dozens will be dead and many more wounded. And the cruelest part? The war did not start on the tracks. It started in a town built to prevent exactly this. A place engineered as a promise, brick by brick, tree by tree, where the factory wasn't just a workplace, but a heartbeat, where homes, stores, and streets all belonged to one man's vision of order. Pullman, a factory town designed as America's industrial future, that instead became a warning from its past. They say you can't kill a giant, but giants die all the time, just not from bullets. They die from hubris, from the moment a visionary dream curdles into control, from the moment a model town stops being a community and becomes a cage. Chapter 1. The Visionary. Before Pullman was a town, before it was a strike, before it was a national wound, it was a man with an almost pathological hatred of inconvenience. In the mid-1800s, Chicago is still half mud, half ambition. Streets are swampy. Drainage is a joke. The city is growing faster than the ground beneath it can handle. And George Mortimer Pullman, born in 1831, makes his first real money doing something that sounds impossible until you see it. He helps jack entire buildings up off the earth so the city can install new infrastructure underneath. Imagine it. A crew in the mud, iron screws, wooden cribbing, men turning handles until brick walls groan. Then, a whole building rises a few inches like it's waking up. That's the kind of mind Pullman has. Not a poet, not a politician. An engineer merchant, the American hybrid. Someone who looks at the world's discomfort and smells profit. And in the 1850s and 1860s, long-distance train travel is discomfort made mobile. Smoke, soot, cramped seats, sleepless nights, and a constant sense that you're surviving the trip rather than traveling. Pullman's idea is insultingly simple. What if the train wasn't a punishment? In 1864, he builds an early sleeper, often cited as the pioneer, a prototype for a new kind of rail travel. private, upholstered, insulated from the chaos outside. And within a few years, demand catches up with the vision. In 1867, he formalizes it, founding the Pullman Palace Car Company. This isn't just product innovation, it's status engineering. Pullman cars become a moving symbol of wealth and modernity, travel that doesn't simply move you but flatters you. They set a new standard for passenger rail in America, transforming overnight travel into something closer to a hotel on steel wheels. And like most industrial miracles, they create a new kind of dependency. Railroads want Pullman cars because passengers want them. Passengers want them because Pullman says they should. And a nation expanding westward, stitching itself together with iron, suddenly has a luxury brand riding its bloodstream. But here's the thing about George Pullman. He doesn't just want to build the best product in the world. He wants to build the best world for building it. By the late 1870s, labor unrest is not an abstract fear. It's a memory still smoking. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 has already shown what happens when the machinery of the country grinds the people too hard. The people grind back. Employers start thinking not only about production, but about control, how to prevent agitation, how to keep workers stable, predictable, grateful. Pullman's answer is breathtaking in its ambition. In 1880, he buys roughly 4,000 acres near Lake Calumet, about 14 miles south of Chicago, along the Illinois Central Line, land positioned like a chess piece beside the tracks. He hires architect Solon Spencer Beeman to design the factory and the town, and landscape architect Nathan F. Barrett to shape the grounds. And then he begins building something that is part utopia, part experiment, part trap. A factory complex in a company town, Pullman, designed to be America's answer to industrial chaos. Not a slum of shacks near smokestacks, a planned community, red brick, limestone trim, wide streets, trees placed deliberately like punctuation, houses with gas and running water and indoor plumbing, modern conveniences meant to feel like proof that the company cared. Pullman believed, at least publicly, that beauty would create loyalty, that if you gave workers clean air, clean streets, and distance from the vice of the city, they would become steady, productive, grateful. No saloons, no rough edges. One approved place to drink, the bar at the Hotel Florence named after his daughter, because even leisure in Pullman must pass through a gate. This is the origin story people love to tell. The visionary industrialist building a better life for his workers. But industrial horror is never about what's said. It's about what's built into the walls, because the same hand that designs comfort can design compliance. The same mind that raises buildings from the mud can raise a town where every door is owned by the company. George Pullman didn't just invent a luxury sleeper car. He started to invent a luxury cage and called it progress. Chapter 2. The Boomtown, April 24th, 1880. Ground breaks, dirt turns. The first scars appear in the prairie, and the future begins to look like a grid. At first, it's just construction. Lumber, brick, iron, men moving like ants across an open field. Then it starts to become a place, a man-made lake, an administration building rising like a civic temple, streets that don't curve naturally but obey, rows of homes, tenements, flats, single-family houses, each one designed to signal dignity and permanence. The story of Pullman's boom is the story of a company that didn't merely expand, it colonized. By January 1st, 1881, the town is ready for its first resident, an employee transferred in with his family, stepping into a place that feels less like a neighborhood and more like a blueprint made real. And to the outside world, it's stunning. In an era when industrial workers are often packed into filthy, dangerous districts, Pullman looks like the future that America is promising itself. a clean, orderly community built around the factory, where the wage earner can come home to something resembling stability. The town includes housing, shops, churches, a theater, parks, a hotel, a library, the full set dressing of civilization. The factory hums. The carpentry shops, the iron works, the paint departments, some created early not only to build rail cars, but to accelerate construction itself, mass-producing the pieces of a town the way a factory produces parts. And in the center of it all is the social contract Pullman is selling. Work for me, and I will give you not only wages, but a life worth living. But the contract has fine print the workers can't ignore, because it's deducted before they ever touch their pay. In Pullman, the company is the landlord. Rent is taken directly from wages. The company is also the utility provider, controlling water and gas rates. And the company is the government. There are no meaningful local elections. Officials are selected, not chosen, except for the school board. So when you walk through Pullman in the 1880s, it's beautiful, but it's a beauty with surveillance baked in. There's an invisible hand on your shoulder. If you're a worker, you don't just clock in at Pullman, you live inside it. And at first, many people like it, or at least they like what it represents compared to the alternatives: clean streets, safe housing, a park where children can run, a library where a tired man can sit in silence and pretend the world is larger than his shift. Pullman becomes famous, a national attraction. Visitors come not just to see how rail cars are made, but to see a model town that claims to have solved the labor problem with architecture. It becomes a kind of industrial theme park for the American elite, proof that capitalism can be benevolent if the boss is smart enough. By the mid-1880s, the place has scale, hundreds of buildings, thousands of residents, and by 1885, the population is reported above 8,600. This is the boom, Pullman as a living advertisement. But here's the quiet, sinister twist. Pullman didn't build this town like a gift. He built it like an investment. He expected rent to produce a return, famously aiming for a percentage that would make the town not just a moral project, but a profitable one. So when workers looked at their clean homes, what Pullman saw was a balance sheet, and the gap between those two ways of seeing, home versus revenue, is where the rot begins. Because a model town only works if the model includes mercy. Then comes 1893, the world's Columbian. Exposition draws crowds to Chicago, and Pullman's town becomes one of the showcase attractions, something visitors talk about in awe: the Arcadian industrial city, the planned utopia beside the tracks. But behind the polished tour route, America is sliding into a brutal economic downturn. After the panic of 1893, a Depression-era squeeze that hits wages and jobs. And this is the moment the social contract is tested like steel under a press. Pullman cuts wages, people's pay shrinks. But rent taken straight from those shrinking wages, does not fall with it. Imagine living in a house where your employer decides your paycheck, and also decides your rent, and then deducts it automatically before you can argue. Imagine watching your wife count coins at the kitchen table, realizing the math no longer works. Imagine stepping out onto a street that looks calm and beautiful, and feeling something uglier underneath. The knowledge that the brick around you is not security, it's leverage. By the spring of 1894, the tension that was always present, hidden behind gardens and trimmed hedges, breaks into the open. Workers describe wage cuts while the costs of living in the company town stay high, and resentment becomes organized fury. And when the strike finally comes on May 11, 1894, it doesn't feel like a sudden explosion. It feels like a door finally slamming after years of being held half open. Because in Pullman, the betrayal isn't that the company demanded labor. It's that the company demanded life, and then treated that life like a revenue stream. The boom town was real, the beauty was real, the pride was real, but so was the control. And control, no matter how clean the streets, always has a cost. Chapter 3, The Arsenal Spring, 1943, somewhere between a training base and the coast. A troop train is dragging itself through the American night like a steel artery under strain. The windows are black rectangles. Inside, the air is heavy with wool uniforms, sweat, cheap tobacco, and the metallic smell of motion. Men are packed into bunks, stacked like shelves, some sleeping, some staring, some writing letters they'll never mail. The rhythm of the wheels is a kind of lullaby, until it isn't. Because in this war, even sleep is logistics. Between December 1941 and June 1945, America's railroads carry nearly 44 million service members, a number so large it stops feeling real, until you imagine each person as a body that must be fed, moved, housed, and, sometimes, comforted. And by spring 1943, about half of Pullman's roughly 7,000 sleeper cars are already tied up transporting troops. Pullman, the brand that once meant silk curtains and hotel-on-rails privilege, has been swallowed by the state. Its product is no longer a luxury, it's a weapon. Not a gun or a tank, but something just as essential. Mobility, and the numbers still don't add up. There aren't enough passenger cars, not enough beds, not enough space. The war doesn't wait for comfort. So the government demands something faster, cheaper, and brutally functional. Cars built not to impress, but to endure. This is where the Pullman Works becomes an arsenal again. In late 1943, the U.S. Office of Defense Transportation contracts with Pullman to build 2,400 troop sleepers. Rail cars designed like rolling barracks, a stripped-down solution built for mass movement. These aren't palace cars. They're pragmatic, utilitarian, steel and bunks and necessity. Picture the factory in those years. The lights never really go out. The air inside is a constant churn of heat and grit. The hammering becomes a language. Rivets become punctuation. Under the cranes, raw material turns into geometry. Walls, frames, ladders, berth supports, until a troop sleeper rolls out not as a symbol of wealth, but as a symbol of pressure. And Pullman's relationship with war is complicated, almost paradoxical. War contracts are lucrative, especially as passenger rail begins to face a slow decline in peacetime, but wartime conditions also tighten labor markets and strengthen workers' leverage. The same national emergency that floods the company with demand also makes labor organizing harder to suppress, so the factory becomes a place of contradictions. The company's iron discipline meets the government's deadlines. The workers' exhaustion meets the nation's panic. The old model town mythology meets the reality that a workforce is not a family, it's a force. And when you pull the camera back far enough, you see why this matters. The Pullman story is usually told as a tragedy that peaks in the 1890s. Company town, wage cuts, strike, blood on the tracks. But history refuses to let it end neatly. The machine survives its own scandal. It keeps building. It keeps feeding the national bloodstream. By World War II, Pullman isn't just transporting troops. It's a silent partner in the largest mobilization in American history. The country's superhighway isn't concrete yet. It's rail. And Pullman's rolling stock is part of what makes that highway function. You can feel it in the way the troop sleepers are described. Less like vehicles, more like temporary worlds. Worlds that smell like steel and fear. Worlds where young men learn how to sleep in fragments. And somewhere behind all of that, the noise, the output, the urgency, there's a bitter irony. For a brief moment, Pullman becomes what George Pullman always claimed he was building, an industrial engine that serves the public good. A system that makes the nation stronger, but the factory doesn't have a soul. It only has a memory. And underneath the wartime glow, That memory still carries an older image, a town that was designed to look like a promise and operated like a contract with no exit. Which is why, when the war ends and America's attention swings back to peace, Pullman's mythology doesn't return as triumph. It returns as a question. How did a company capable of building this, capable of moving millions, feeding an army, stitching a continent together, also become the name etched into one of the most infamous betrayals in labor history? To answer that, you have to rewind, back past the troop sleepers, back past the national emergency, back to the moment the poison entered the blueprint. Chapter 4. The Poison, May 1894. Pullman, Chicago. Morning arrives clean, almost offensively so. The streets are trimmed. The brick is proud. The trees stand where they were told to stand. It's the kind of place visitors call orderly and beautiful, as if beauty itself can be a wage. But inside the homes, the math is failing. On paper, this is still the model town. In reality, the panic of 1893 has tightened its fist around the country, and Pullman's workers feel it in the simplest, cruelest place. Their pay envelopes. Wages are cut. Piece rates reduced. Until men who once survived can no longer breathe financially. And the rent doesn't move. In Pullman, the company is the boss and the landlord, and rent is often deducted directly from wages. So when wages fall and rent stays fixed, workers don't experience a hard time. They experience a trap. This is where the town's beauty begins to feel like a threat, because the brick homes are not simply homes, they're leverage. The clean streets are not simply streets, they're the corridors of a controlled experiment. Pullman's utopia was built on one fatal assumption, that loyalty can be engineered the way a railcar can. By early May 1894, the workers are done swallowing it quietly. A grievance committee meets with company officials demanding relief, wage restoration, rent reduction. George Pullman meets them, hears them, and refuses to bend in the way a human system must bend to survive. This is the poison, not merely greed, not merely stinginess, but the certainty that he cannot be wrong. And because Pullman cannot be wrong, the workers must be wrong. So the company does what controlled systems do when they sense rebellion. It tightens, it dismisses, it isolates, it waits for hunger to win. Instead, hunger organizes. On May 11, 1894, Pullman workers strike. It begins as something local, a community pushing back against its owner. But Pullman's product is not local. It rides the nation's rails. And when the American Railway Union under Eugene V. Debs joins the fight through a boycott of trains hauling Pullman cars, the conflict erupts outward like a shockwave through the national network. Now it's not just a labor dispute, it's a national seizure. Rail traffic across huge stretches of the country west of Chicago is disrupted. The superhighway of the era, the railroad system, begins to choke. And when commerce chokes, the state shows its teeth. The federal government responds with legal weapons. First, an injunction used to break the strike, one of the landmark moments when the courts become a tool of strike-breaking power. Then comes the physical force. Troops are ordered into Chicago. The arrival escalates the situation instead of calming it. In the rail yards, tension becomes violence, crowds, soldiers, clashes, until the conflict leaves dozens dead and many more wounded, and the story twists into its most sickening irony. Pullman's town was built to prevent unrest, built to eliminate disorder, built to keep workers content. Yet the system he created helps ignite one of the most consequential labor explosions in American history. The strike is ultimately crushed. Debs is arrested. The boycott breaks. The workers are forced back, not into victory, but into the bitter realization that the state and the railroads can fuse into something heavier than any union, something that can move armies and judges with the same momentum. And then comes the condemnation, not from radicals, but from an official voice of the nation itself. The federal investigation into the strike does not immortalize Pullman as a misunderstood philanthropist. It brands the system as fundamentally wrong, admired by visitors, yes, but of little value to workers when they can't afford bread. This is what hubris earns, not just defeat, but exposure. After the strike, Pullman's name becomes radioactive. His perfect town is no longer a postcard. It's evidence. When George Pullman dies on October 19th, 1897, his family doesn't treat his burial like a private ceremony. They treat it like a security operation. His coffin sealed and fortified in concrete and steel, out of fear that anger might reach him even in death. That burial isn't just a macabre detail. It's a metaphor, because it tells you something essential. The man who tried to control a town understood at the end that control creates enemies powerful enough to haunt you beyond your lifetime. Then the law finishes what the strike began. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court orders the Pullman Company to divest its non-industrial property in the town, forcing the company to relinquish the utopia it owned, because owning a town was not what its charter was meant to permit. Pullman, the experiment, starts to dissolve. The model town begins to slip out of corporate hands, but the poison has already done its work, because even as the company continues in other forms and other eras, the Pullman name is now attached to a lesson America learns the hard way. You can build beauty. You can build order, you can even build a town. But if the foundation is control, if the gift is actually a ledger, then one day the place you designed to look like the future becomes the setting for a warning. And warnings don't stay contained, they travel. Just like trains. Chapter 5. The Warning Signs. If the Pullman strike was the gunshot, then what followed was the slow internal bleeding, the part of the story where the company keeps living but never fully stops dying. On paper, Pullman survives 1894. The brand doesn't vanish, the cars don't stop rolling, the name stays on the rails. But the town, George Pullman's prized invention, the model meant to prove that industry could be humane, starts slipping out of corporate control. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court orders Pullman to sell off its non-industrial properties, and after a deferment, sales of town properties begin in the early 1900s. The first warning sign is simple. The experiment couldn't withstand scrutiny. Once the illusion cracks, Pullman can't be both a factory and a government without someone, somewhere, eventually calling it what it is. And Pullman's second warning sign is quieter, but more dangerous. The company begins to evolve from a builder's obsession into a machine that feeds on its own monopoly. By 1900, Pullman has reorganized and consolidated into the Pullman Company, in an era when it effectively dominates sleeping car service. Its cars, its staff, its rules, running like a private hotel chain on public rails. That's power, that's leverage, and leverage changes people. You can feel the culture shift in the corporate architecture. In 1927, the company structure is reorganized again. The Pullman Company becomes separate, and Pullman Incorporated is created as a holding company. This is the beginning of the modern corporate beast. Not a single workshop building objects, but a layered entity designed to manage revenue streams, assets, subsidiaries, and risk. It's not that rail cars stop being built. It's that the center of gravity moves from craft to control, from engineering to finance. Then labor starts whispering again, because labor always does when the math stops working. Pullman's most visible workforce, the men whose faces passengers actually see, are the Pullman porters, who are overwhelmingly black. Their job is both prestigious and humiliating, a uniformed role that can provide a foothold into the black middle class. while demanding deference, endurance, and a kind of smiling invisibility. Many porters live on tips. Their working conditions are harsh. Their dignity is often treated like part of the service. And in 1925, those workers organize into the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, led by A. Philip Randolph, a union that becomes historically seismic. The warning sign here isn't just a union formed, it's that Pullman's labor model, built on discipline and dependency, keeps producing resistance generation after generation, even when the company tries to rebrand itself as respectable and modern. After years of struggle, Pullman signs its first agreement with the Brotherhood in 1937, bringing major gains in wages and work rules. That's another crack in the old myth, because it means the company's order was never natural. It required pressure, and when workers finally get leverage back, even partially, the machine has to yield. Then the company changes shape again. In the 1930s, Pullman's manufacturing side merges and consolidates, eventually becoming Pullman Standard Car Manufacturing Company, through a merger finalized in 1934 as commonly summarized in corporate histories. On the surface, this looks like strength, a bigger, more diversified industrial footprint, but it's also a survival adaptation. It's Pullman trying to remain indispensable as the nature of travel begins to shift. Because here comes the real slow poison. America is changing the way it moves. World War II gives rail a final surge of national centrality. Troop sleepers, packed trains, mass mobilization. Pullman is busy, and the country needs it. But after the war, a new dream takes over. Highways, cars, suburbanization, aviation. Passenger rail begins losing the cultural and economic war for the American traveler. Death not by explosion, but by irrelevance. And when the world shifts like that, monopolies become targets. In 1940, the U.S. Department of Justice files an antitrust complaint aimed at Pullman's dominance, specifically the entanglement of its sleeping car service with manufacturing. In 1944, a federal court orders Pullman to divest, forcing a choice: separate the sleeping car operations from the manufacturing business. This is not a minor regulatory inconvenience. This is the government saying, your business model is too powerful to be allowed to remain whole. And if you want to understand the human feel of this moment, imagine how it lands inside the works and the offices. The factory workers hear divestiture and wonder if it means layoffs. The managers hear it and start thinking in spreadsheets and exits. The porters hear it and realize the company's aura of permanence is a costume, because permanence is the most dangerous drug a corporation can take. Pullman took it early, and now the withdrawal is beginning. The warning signs are everywhere by mid-century. Legal fracture, labor power slowly hardening, travel habits drifting away from overnight rail, and a company built on one golden product, sleeping cars, watching the country learn to sleep somewhere else. And the cruelest warning sign of all, the Pullman Works, the great cathedral of industrial Chicago, the place where America's hotel on wheels was born, still stands there like it always has. Red brick and smoke and history, but the heartbeat inside it is starting to stutter. Chapter 6. The Collapse. 1955. Pullman, Chicago. There are factory towns that die loudly with a single catastrophic headline. An explosion, a fire, a sudden bankruptcy. Pullman dies the way a lot of American industry dies. Like a decision, a meeting, a memo. A plan made somewhere far from the shop floor where the numbers don't smell like oil and metal. And then one day, the gates that always opened don't. Multiple sources place the closure of Pullman's factory in the Pullman neighborhood of Chicago in 1955. Try to picture what that means in physical human terms. It's not just lost jobs. It's the end of a rhythm that structured life. Shift changes, lunch pails, whistles, paydays, the small rituals that turn a workplace into a calendar. When a plant like Pullman shuts down, it doesn't simply stop producing rail cars, it stops producing meaning. And the neighborhood absorbs that absence like a bruise spreading under the skin. In the decades after the factory closure, Pullman's identity is forced to mutate. The grand promise, live here, work here, build the future here, becomes a relic. Civic groups and preservationists later fight to keep parts of the historic district from being demolished and redeveloped into something that would erase the story entirely. But even with the factory closed, Pullman, the corporate entity, doesn't vanish overnight. It keeps living in pieces, subsidiaries, holdings, operations, and those pieces keep shrinking. The sleeping car service that made Pullman a household name is already being hollowed out by the post-war travel revolution. By the 1960s, passenger rail is losing ground to the interstates and airlines, America's new arteries. Then comes the moment that feels like a funeral bell. At midnight on December 31st, 1968, Pullman's operation of sleeping cars in the United States ceases. It's hard to explain how symbolic that date is without sounding dramatic. So don't think of it as a service ended. Think of it as a century-long institution turning off like a light. For decades, Pullman had been called the world's greatest hotel in motion, an overnight system that once hosted tens of thousands of sleepers a night at its peak, with porters and conductors forming a traveling workforce that shaped American mobility and black labor history. And then the leases terminate. The operations stop. The identity dissolves. On January 1st, 1969, the Pullman Company is dissolved and its assets are liquidated in the wind down that follows. A Chicago History Museum photo record even captures interiors of the Pullman Standard plant in January 1969, framed as days after the company was dissolved and liquidated. A strange, sterile kind of afterimage. Industry still standing, but spiritually evacuated. This is the collapse phase that rarely gets filmed correctly because it isn't cinematic in the usual way. It's cinematic like an abandoned hospital is cinematic. The machines are still there. The walls are still there. The windows still catch the light. But the purpose is gone, and purpose is what makes a place feel alive. And then you zoom in on the people. The workers who built the cars, many forced to reinvent themselves in a city that is already beginning its own post-war economic turbulence. The families who stayed because their roots are in the brick. The porters, some absorbed into new arrangements as railroads, and later Amtrak take over pieces of passenger service, carrying the culture of Pullman service into an era that no longer honors the old rituals the way it once did. And over all of it, the bitter symmetry of the Pullman story. A company built a town to control labor. The town became the stage for labor revolt. The company survived the revolt, but not the future. It outlived its founder, its myth, and eventually its own reason for existence. The collapse isn't a single moment. It's a long withdrawal from relevance, ending in a final calendar-perfect cutoff, December 31st, 1968. A neat date, a clean ending. And yet nothing about what follows is clean. Because when an industry leaves, it doesn't just take jobs. It takes the story people told themselves about why they were here. And Pullman, America's first great factory town, becomes something else. Not a promise. A ruin in waiting. A museum of consequences. Chapter 7. The Ruins. Present day. Chicago's far south side. If you arrive the way most Americans once did, by car, off wide roads that feel designed for leaving, you almost miss it. Then the brick rises. The administration and clock tower building stands like a red cathedral that somehow survived the 20th century's appetite for demolition. Its clock faces look down with the calm authority of an era that believed time itself could be disciplined. And for a long time, it didn't look like this. It burned catastrophically in 1998, leaving a gutted shell that felt less like a historic landmark and more like a public autopsy. Now it's been pulled back from the edge. The National Park Service has continued stabilizing and repairing the structure, and the building is central to the visitor experience at Pullman. The official NPS Visitor Center information reads like a quiet miracle of bureaucracy. A place with hours and amenities, a phone number, a mailing address. Simple proof that the ruins have been recognized as something worth tending. But the real Pullman isn't just one building. It's the feeling you get when you step out and realize this company town is still a neighborhood, still lived in, still breathing, like a ghost that learned how to share space with the living. Walk the streets and you'll see the famous row houses, their brickwork warm in sunlight, their roof lines repeating like industrial. Music. Some are lovingly restored, some are worn and patched. That contrast is part of the story now. Preservation as a form of resistance, maintenance as a refusal to let history become rubble. And that preservation didn't happen by accident. In the 1960s, plans were floated that could have wiped Pullman away in favor of new industrial development. One more progress project built on erasure. Residents and advocates pushed back, and over time, Pullman gained layers of recognition. National Register listing, 1969, National Historic Landmark District, 1970, and Chicago Landmark District status, 1972. Those designations sound like paperwork, but they are also armor. They are the reason the story still has a physical stage. And then, in 2015, Pullman becomes a National Park Service unit when it's designated Pullman National Monument by presidential proclamation. Later, legislation signed on December 29, 2022 redesignates it as Pullman National Historical Park, a subtle wording change that still lands like validation. This is not just a monument to a man, but a park built around a story. Labor, community, race, industry, control. So yes, Pullman is saved, in a way, but saved doesn't mean healed, because Pullman's ruins aren't only broken windows and rust. The ruins are conceptual, they're psychological, they're the invisible lines of ownership that once ran through every household, every paycheck, every choice. You can feel that history most sharply when you look at what sits near the clock tower, the industrial grounds where rail cars were once born in deafening rhythm. The Park Service documents talk about stabilizing and repairing the structure, replacing roofs and windows, preservation as constant triage. This is the thing about industrial ruins. They don't decay like castles. Castles decay romantically. Ivy creeps in, tourists take photos, and history becomes aesthetic. Factories decay like bodies. Steel doesn't age, it corrodes. Brick doesn't weather, it cracks. Every stain looks like an old injury. Every fenced-off section looks like a quarantine. And when you stand there and listen, you realize the most haunting sound isn't wind through broken frames. It's the absence of the old noise. Because in Pullman's golden years, this place was a 24/7 animal. It breathed smoke, it exhaled rail cars. The town and the works were one loop. Labor in, product out, wages in, rent out. An ecosystem built around a single corporate heart. Then the heart stopped. The factory in Pullman closed in 1955, and the Pullman sleeping car era, the brand's main mythology, ends on a date as cold as a tombstone. December 31st, 1968, with the company dissolved and its assets liquidated in the wind down. So what's left? A neighborhood that refuses to vanish. A park trying to translate pain into interpretation panels, and buildings that remain as evidence of an American dream with teeth, You walk past Hotel Florence, named for Pullman's daughter, once a controlled gateway for visitors where respectable outsiders could sip and sleep while the town stayed orderly. It has spent long stretches closed, awaiting the next round of restoration, a reminder that even preserved history can sit in limbo, waiting for funding, politics, and someone willing to gamble on the past. And then there's the museum layer, the part of Pullman's legacy that isn't brick, but human record, the story of the Pullman porters and what it meant to be the face of American travel while being denied full American dignity. Pullman can't be understood without that, because the company didn't just manufacture rolling luxury, it also manufactured a traveling labor caste system that shaped black work and organizing in the 20th century. So the ruins of Pullman today are not a single abandoned site you can trespass through for photos. They are a living contradiction. A preserved district that still bears the imprint of control, a national park built on the memory of a company town that proved why company towns are dangerous, and a place where the past hasn't finished arguing with the present. The ghosts here aren't paranormal, they're structural. They're the idea that a corporation can build a community and call it kindness, while retaining the right to squeeze, evict, and silence. They're the idea that beauty can excuse domination. And when the sun drops low over the brick, it almost looks peaceful, like the town finally got the quiet it was always designed to enforce. Almost. Chapter 8. Conclusion. Pullman is one of those American stories that feels too symbolic to be real. A man invents a luxury product that changes a nation's relationship with distance, turning travel into comfort, discomfort into profit. Then that man builds a town to perfect the conditions of production, an engineered community designed to manufacture not just rail cars, but loyalty. And when the economy tightens, the system reveals what it always was, a contract where one side owns the other side's shelter. That's the core tragedy of Pullman. It wasn't destroyed by fate. It was undone by design. Because the true villain here wasn't a single bad year, or one recession, or one strike. Those were triggers. The real villain, the thing that keeps repeating in American industrial history, is hubris. The belief that power can be made permanent, that people can be treated as components, that a model can replace consent. George Pullman sold a dream of order. He sold it with clean streets and brick homes and the promise of dignity. But the dignity came with a receipt, and history collected. The Pullman Strike became a national crisis because it exposed something the country still struggles to admit, that America's prosperity has often depended on systems that work best when workers have the fewest options. When you build an economy on dependency and then act shocked when people fight their way out, you're not witnessing chaos, you're witnessing consequence. Then the other tragedy arrives, the one that feels like a second betrayal. Pullman, the brand, survives the strike. The company continues. It reorganizes, merges, adapts, like so many giants do, shedding skin to stay alive. But the world that made Pullman inevitable begins to fade. After World War II, the rails lose their monopoly on movement. The American superhighway becomes literal. Interstates, cars, and air travel. The very thing Pullman helped build, national mobility, evolves into forms that no longer need Pullman. And that's where the industrial horror becomes almost poetic. The company that once symbolized modern travel becomes obsolete in a modernity of its own making. Then the end arrives, not with a single explosion, but in stages. The Pullman factory in the Pullman neighborhood closes in 1955. Pullman's sleeping car operations end at midnight on December 31st, 1968. The company dissolves, the assets scatter, and the myth is left behind like a husk. So what did we lose when Pullman fell? We lost more than a factory. We lost a particular kind of America, the one that believed industry could be a lifelong identity, that a craft and a paycheck could anchor a family for generations. That belief had its own dangers. It often demanded silence in exchange for stability, but it also gave people something increasingly rare, a sense that their work mattered to the country. At Pullman, the work did matter, sometimes even globally, especially during wartime mobilization. And yet, the lesson Pullman leaves behind isn't simply industry is noble or capitalism is evil. It's more uncomfortable than that. Systems don't become cruel only when bad men take over. Sometimes they become cruel because they were built to prioritize control from the start. That's why Pullman still hits like a nerve, because in modern language, Company Town doesn't sound like a 19th century brick experiment. It sounds like dependency by another name, housing tied to employment, healthcare tied to employment, survival tied to a private decision made in a room you'll never enter. Pullman's story is not ancient, it's evergreen, which is why it matters that the place still stands, now protected as a national historical park, interpreted, stabilized, restored, not to glorify the genius of one titan, but to keep the warning intact. Because if you stand under that clock tower today, you can feel two Americas overlapping. The America that believed it could engineer human life into efficiency, and the America that learned, through strikes, blood, and exhaustion, that people eventually refused to be engineered. The town was designed to look like a promise, but history exposed it as a test. And every generation since has been taking the same test, just with new materials. So the camera pulls back one last time. Brick rows, iron tracks, the restored tower watching over it all like an old judge. The sunlight hits the masonry. The neighborhood is quiet, not dead, not abandoned, just older, a survivor. And the haunting line isn't that Pullman failed. It's that Pullman worked exactly as intended, until the people inside it finally stopped pretending they were parts. Because in the end, you can kill a giant. You just don't do it with a weapon. You do it by refusing to live inside its shadow.